Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's fascinating to see how our yards are progressing. You know, the annual flowers and planters and everything with these long days, and they're blooming. They're starting to do a lot of color show, so I'm excited. I'm still doing a little bit of planting. You know, I'm never totally done with planting, but now I'm heavily into weeding mode.
Yes.
You know, the weeds have grown.
All this rain is really contributed
so now
to that.
I'm heavy into weeding and mulching.
Yep.
And so how about you? How's everything doing in your yard?
Kind of the same thing. You know, we did have a little bit of storm damage, so that's one thing that we're going to talk about on this show. But we're also going to talk about it being towards the end of June. You know, we're heading into July. In July, there's a significant holiday, not only for all Americans, but especially for gardeners
Independence Day for gardeners.
That's right.
Yep. It's kind of a switching point, certain things that we discontinue doing. So, yeah, it'll be interesting to talk about that as well.
Well, you know, a lot of people, certainly a lot of listeners know, a lot of people won't remember it or won't forget anytime soon, but we had a big storm system move through here late last week, and a lot of wind, a lot of rain damage, a couple fatalities, unfortunately, really. And, but so we're going to talk about that as far as how the summer weather, you know, kind of how we can, what happens when we get damage to trees, damage to annuals and perennials. In fact, you have a question from a reader.
I do that also relates to the storm damage that the area saw. And so anyway, Whitney writes in and says, I've been listening and learning from your podcast since it started. I appreciate all the work you and John put into the show, and it helped me so much. So thanks for that, Whitney. Whitney continues, last Friday, the strong storm winds ripped my lilac in half. Fortunately, that was the only damage my property received. Many others fared far worse. The lilac's base, just under the soil, split in half and fell in two different directions, one leaning on a fence and the other leaning on a 3-foot garden fence. The base or crown was split, but the majority of the roots are still intact. My husband and I added some compost around the base and used ropes and ratchet straps to bring it back up and together in its original shape. And so any additional advice, anything we should watch for? So thanks again, Whitney, for writing in. And so Whitney also sent some photos. And from the photos, I see that the lilac was kind of in somewhat of a tree form. You know, there are different ways of growing lilacs. You can grow them so that they're more shrub-like all the way to the base, or you can grow them so that they're more open at the base. My mom and dad had an ongoing, they didn't argue about much, but one thing they did have differing opinions on was how to grow a lilac.
Okay.
My mom liked the lilacs full all the way to the base, you know, full with foliage branches all the way to the base. My dad had grown up in New Jersey, and they trimmed their lilacs so that they were open at the base. So you could see the trunks of those, and the lilac and foliage was up at the top, more like kind of a little tree form, a multi-trunk tree. Well, anyway, in the photos that Whitney sent, it's more like that. You could see the openness at the base, the multi-trunked lilac. And so when you picture a storm affecting that, the multi-trunk kind of splayed apart, it appeared to be. And so the halves, the several different trunks went in opposite directions and split the multi-trunk thing apart. And so, yeah, definitely try, as Whitney and her husband did, pulling it back together and get it to come. Now, that may or may not work. What I suggested when I replied back was that they watch for wilting of leaves. In case the root system or the crown where the trunks enter the ground, if that was damaged to a point where it can't get water and stuff up anymore, watch for wilting of leaves. And if that does happen, I would immediately cut the whole thing back, a dramatic surgery, almost to 6 inches above ground level, and force the roots to regrow. It may take a while to get it back into that kind of a tree form, multi-trunk tree form that you've got, but at least it would save. Lilacs have a tremendous push power from their roots. And so by cutting it back, you would force that to come. But wait to see if it does, if it carries on the way you've got it, and then go from there. So thanks again for Whitney and all who write in. We appreciate the letters.
Yeah, there certainly was a lot of there have been other storms that have maybe had more tree damage, but you did hear about that in certain areas. In Fargo-Moorhead, maybe we didn't get as much, but in certain areas, Jamestown,
Enderlin area, Hunter,
Yep.
Page, within like a 40, 50, 60 miles radius from Fargo. And some of the photos of the tree damage were just devastating. There were old established trees, I don't know, maybe 70 years old, where the tree trunks were totally splintered as though they were toothpicks.
Yeah.
Just snapped, part way up. Other trees, from photographs, other trees, the entire big tree was toppled horizontally, and with the roots popping out of the ground.
Yeah.
And so just think of the force that would have taken for that. And so, yeah, and of course, then there's also, and we can talk about each of these kind of cases too as to what you do, but then also lots of just branch breakage and things that people need to repair and assess on that.
Well, let's talk about that. What happens when your tree is damaged in a storm? What are some of the what are the things that we need to consider? What are the things that we can do?
Well, some of the trees that are just obviously ruined, the trees that just snap in half, the trees that are totally uprooted. I mean, there's no guessing there as to what happened. Those trees are just gone, which is unfortunate. But, on the upside, we can replant. The best time to plant an oak tree was 30 years ago. The next best time is this afternoon. So at least trees we can replant, even though it's unfortunately, because it does take certainly many years. So in those cases, it's obvious what to do. Otherwise, if it's some branch breakage, whether it's small branches or large branches, in those cases, we need to kind of just step back and assess. So first of all, if branches broke, for anyone listening, and not necessarily these storms that went through, but any storms that go through in the summertime, at some point, we almost all deal with broken branches on our trees. So if you stand back and if a branch was broken, hanging down. Oftentimes they'll be hanging by a hinge of wood. And of course, that needs to be cut off. Occasionally I'll get the question as to whether, can we bring that back up in place? Similar to what Whitney and that did when their tree kind of tended to split apart, cinching it back together. But that was down at the base of a multi-trunk. Okay. So I think that may work for Whitney. But when you have a branch hanging, can you bring that back up, tie it up, and will it weld itself back together? Not usually. And so the best thing to do is to cut that branch off. A couple of things to do when you're cutting that to make sure that the tree has a potential to heal itself. First of all, don't leave stubs. If it didn't break off next to the trunk and is hanging there, but instead it broke off, leaving a stub. If you just removed that, you'd leave a stub. That's not the best way. So broken branches should be cut back to either the main trunk, which is usually kind of where they break, it seems. And so the cuts should be as smooth as possible. Usually when a branch goes, it leaves a jagged, ragged cut. Maybe there's bark kind of hanging there. So make the wound as smooth and clean as possible. Maybe you need a sharp knife. Maybe a saw is sharp enough to make that good smooth cut. The tree's ability to heal wounds depends on that cut being fairly smooth. And so when you assess the tree, after you've removed the branch that obviously kind of is hanging there, needs to come off, take a look at the tree. Take a look at what you have left. If the branch was such that half the canopy is now gone, that tree may not ever recover its form. So maybe it's better to start on the road to getting a new tree in that place. If once those branches are taken off, you still have a decent looking tree, a decent canopy, well, then that's worth working with. So now back to the cuts that a person needed to make when those branches are damaged. So smooth the cut. As smooth as you can get it, because that's where the growth ring will occur that will seal off that damage. Have you ever noticed, John, a tree that maybe it was pruned, a big limb taken off that needed to come off, or maybe it was a storm damage? But have you ever noticed a number of years later where on that wound, that big round wound, there is a roll of tissue that forms?
It's almost like a collar.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That surrounds that, and eventually that can close up the wound. And in the meantime, that ring of tissue, that collar, has protected that wound from anything bad getting in, wood rotting, etc. It's kind of sealed off the edges of that. And so that's the hope for that. So common question is, when we have a big wound like that, should we be putting some pruning paints or sealers, latex paint? Is there anything that we can do to help that sealing process? Because it seems like when something happens like that, we'd like to help that tree. We'd like to give it something that we could be doing. But pruning paints, sealers, latex paints have been shown to not help the healing situation. In fact, they can cause problems. One of the main problems that they cause is they create a coating over that surface, and it traps in some bad stuff under that. It can trap in bacteria and fungi, also traps kind of moisture inside, and that's a spot where wood-rotting fungi and bacteria can get started. So coating it with a material doesn't help the tree. In fact, can cause some extra problems. So there's nothing like that we need or should be doing. Just the good, clean cut is the main thing.
With that, so let's say that you've got a tree in your yard that had a branch break off. And let's say that branch is up fairly high, and maybe like too high that you can't get to with a ladder. And, if you bring in an arborist, that could be a pretty expensive bill. What would happen if you just left that jagged edge up there? I mean, is it for sure a death knell to the tree? I mean, it's not beneficial. It's not going to help it, but is it, if it's really hard to get to it, is it okay sometimes letting them go?
In nature, that's what happens.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, I've watched an oak tree along the riverbank in Fargo that was struck by lightning. And the branch, big branch that was struck by lightning was hanging. It kind of was cracked and hung, and it hung there. And that oak tree has persisted. So, when you walk through a forest, they're rarely picture perfect if you actually start noticing the trees. There's storm damage in many cases, and in many cases in a forest, there's no one there to clean it up. So there are things hanging there. There's jagged edges. And with a little luck, knock on wood, the tree will be okay and carry on. But we can increase the odds of it recovering by making those clean cuts. But in nature, if it's way up there and you can't do it, maybe the arborists are busy getting all these really bad storm damaged trees. Sometimes you have no option other than to leave it there and hope that Mother Nature will kind of smile kindly on that tree. And because in nature that does happen, and the tree, it doesn't necessarily mean a death knell for that tree if something happens. There's also, when we're having a discussion of storm damaged trees, sometimes trees will crack. The pressure on both sides, limbs kind of coming in, pressure will kind of split the tree. Sometimes there will be a crack. Maybe not such that it totally opened up, but a very noticeable crack. Now, one thing that arborists can do is they can bolt trees together to keep that together. And with a little luck, if the crack hasn't totally separated the tissue, we talked about a limb hanging there and not being able to bring it back up. But if that crack is such that the tree is still basically welded together, sap and water are flowing up and down as normal, but yet it's just a stress point that you don't want to let go any worse in the next storm. And so what the arborists can do is they drill a hole all the way through the tree, maybe in a couple of points. Then they insert a threaded rod, metal rod with threads. And then on each side of it, you put a large washer and a nut, and tighten it all up back together so that the tree is stabilized. And that rod and the nuts stay there. And the tree will grow around that just fine. And that is a way that in some cases to stabilize a tree. So, that's an option sometimes for people as well. Now, okay, it's interesting. We mentioned a threaded rod. If you were trying to stabilize that tree by putting for example, a chain or something around the outside diameter, that doesn't work, because if something totally circles around the tree trunk, the tree can't expand. One threaded rod or two, one up and down, one above and one further down, that tree can still expand around that. But if we totally encircle a tree trunk, then as that tree expands, you'll have the boa constrictor effect. There's lots of old photos where somebody tied a chain around a fence, and then 15 years later that chain is embedded inside, and the tree at some point might strangle. Or there's a barbed wire fence on one side, and then as the tree grew, it kind of grows around that. And but the threaded rods seem to work quite well in the right situations.
We were just earlier when we were talking about lilacs, that if damage is done, maybe the best thing to do would be to cut it down, a couple inches above the earth. Not the same with trees, right? I mean, if a tree has to be cut down, it's not going to grow back, is it?
Yeah, exactly. Because like a lilac, which is usually more of a shrub form, when you get all this proliferation of branches coming up, well, that's a good thing on a lilac or other shrubs. But when a tree is cut down, now the root system may still be, if it didn't pop out of the ground, the root system on a live tree, when you cut it down, that root system may try to burst forth with this little forest full of shoots. But trees are mostly meant to have one, maybe multiple trunk. But if you get 30 little sprouts all coming from that trunk that was cut down, it's not going to develop into a good sturdy tree.
They're all going to be competing for the same resources.
And even if you cut all of those out and just left one, that one coming out of that isn't very structurally sound.
Typically, you see that a lot with maples. There will be a lot of maple volunteers. Things
exactly.
Like that.
And so even if you cut down or lost the mother tree, if you've ever examined those kind of sucker sprouts that come out, they're kind of weak. In fact, if you get them while they're young enough, you can just take your hand and flick it down, because they kind of come out at an odd angle out of the main trunk. And so I don't think I've ever seen a tree regrow from a cut stump. I'm sure somewhere out there probably is, but generally it's better just to plant a new tree.
Yeah. With that in mind, I remember a couple of years ago during one storm, we had straight line winds a couple of years ago, and watching John Wheeler on that night talking about the winds. And he was saying that the trees to look out for a lot of times are the pine trees, evergreens, that pine trees, because their root systems are so shallow and so close to the top that if the ground gets wet and the winds come along, they're easy to topple. Are there other trees that if you're concerned about this, are there other trees that are easy to topple that you think of? I mean, I think cottonwoods seem to kind of come down kind of easily. Are there certain trees
that's a good point, because
you're nervous about?
evergreens do have a shallow root system, and they are some of the most common that you see in storms like that do just pop, topple. Root system pops out of the ground. And others, you mentioned the poplars. Yes. In fact, last year, the spring in the Fargo area was so wet, really wet, soupy clay soil wet. And when we had some strong winds, we had some younger poplars. Well, young, they were planted maybe 8 years ago, fairly sizable, but they rotated the entire trunk and root system rotated so that they were at a 45-degree angle. And so while the soil was still squishy wet, we cinched them back up and knocked on wood, and they survived. So poplars are one that's kind of shallow rooted and fast growing, kind of shallow rooted, maybe weak on the weak order. And but evergreens are the ones especially that a person kind of sees in that category. But it's interesting as we're talking about this whole thing on storm damage, whether it's trees or other things. It's an interesting discussion too. Are there some things that we can do to mitigate, or if a storm is forecast, there's some things that we can do? A big tree, there's really not much we can do to try to prevent possible wind damage. But I'm thinking on younger trees, for example, on those poplars that I mentioned, 8 years in a tree's life is pretty young.
Yep.
Okay. If I had known that the ground was that squishy and we were going to get 50 miles an hour wind that we're going to make these grow at 45-degree angles, I would have driven some fence posts in and secured those so that they wouldn't tip like that. So on a younger tree, if a person had enough forecast, a person maybe would put in some fence posts.
So let's talk about that. Like when you're putting in, we do this a lot when we're planting new trees. You want some kind of support to either side to make sure that if a wind comes along, it doesn't, totally knock it over. But you want to be careful with how you wrap the tree. Because you'll have the support off to maybe about 3 or 4 feet out on either side, but you'll have something. Sometimes it's fabric. Sometimes I've seen people use garden hose. Mm-hmm. When you put something around the tree, what's the key so that, like earlier, you're not chaining it where it's just going to strangle the tree?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the point at which the tree stake attaches to the trunk has to be something that has some give, so it's not totally encircling the tree. You mentioned garden hose, section of garden hose. So you attach a wire to the posts, and then the wire goes through the garden hose, and the garden hose is what actually contacts the tree trunk. I've used cloth strips. Kind of wire the ends of cloth strips, and the cloth strip is what actually contacts. That's a nice tree-friendly way too. And there are garden centers sell tree stake kits that have kind of a rubber, almost like a bungee tie that goes around. A bungee tie might even work too for those. But, it's interesting. In the discussion of staking trees, the recommended is to only stake a tree 1 or at most 2 seasons.
Yeah.
One reason for not staking it too long, we might think, well, gosh, why not just leave these tree stakes on, for 8 years or however long, and then it'll protect from storm damage. The problem with leaving a tree stake on more than a season or 2 is it babies that tree along too much. If you don't allow some natural wind movement, natural wind movement is different than making the tree bend at a 45-degree angle, but a little bit of movement helps strengthen the fibers of the trunk. The fibers in the trunk become stronger, and also the root system will kind of will learn to compensate for a little bit of wind. The roots will learn to kind of grab in. And so if that tree is staked so solidly that it gets no movement, you don't get the fibers creating structure in the trunk. And also the roots don't learn that they've got to grab hold a little better too. So, again, if a person had enough time, advance notice of a storm coming or heavy wind on a young tree, maybe pound in those stakes and give it some support. But again, they aren't meant to stay on more than one season usually.
So if you have a tree that has to come out or came down, what are you thinking for replacements?
Oh, some good options. Lots of good options. If you're thinking of a smaller scale tree, kind of in the neighborhood of a flowering crabapple, kind of a decorative type tree like that, they grow, maybe 25 feet tall. There are lots of new varieties of flowering crabapples. They're beautiful, more disease resistant, and they don't have the messy fruits that drop on and get squishy on your sidewalks. And many of the fruits are tiny and persist into winter and then just kind of disappear. Sometimes birds clean them up, or they're so tiny that they just filter into the lawn. Do you have one of the older varieties, John?
We do, yeah.
Inside
of the house, yeah.
With the big, they're beautiful, but the big squishy fruits.
Yeah, we've got one over the side of the house, and so it leaves in the fall there'll be a big mess of fruit kind of embedded into the asphalt shakes, and then the turkeys will go up there and try to eat it off. So it
awesome.
becomes a whole thing.
So anyway, check out the new varieties of those. And also blooming right now in the area on boulevards and streets and home yards, Japanese tree lilac. You wouldn't even recognize that it's a lilac. I get lots of questions as to what is that beautiful tree. Again, they're 20, 25 feet, maybe up to 30 feet, big poofs of white
kind
blossoms.
Of creamy.
Yeah.
They're out right
that's
now.
That's a botanical term, a poof.
Poof, yes.
Yeah, kind of a big pyramidal-shaped flower cluster blooming beautifully right now. Nice, neat tree, even when they aren't blooming. They're a wonderful tree for a yard or a boulevard. Or another one that's wonderful for a smaller scale tree is hot wings Tatarian maple.
I do not know this.
Yeah,
one.
that one's a little more tolerant of our soils in our area than some of the maples. Hot wings Tatarian maple. You have to look that one up. The reason it's called hot wings is these seed pods that it develops, and they don't make mess. They're not like my elm tree that got seeds all over the place. Hot wings Tatarian maple, the seed pods are a brilliant red, a scarlet, and they're very, very beautiful and ornamental. And the leaves on the tree is nice, gets a good fall color. And so for big shade type trees, lindens, there are lots of good linden cultivars at garden centers. Hackberry, good native tree. Buckeye, there's some good buckeyes, a couple developed at NDSU, Lava Burst and Prairie Torch. Beautiful. One I like is Prairie Reflection Laurel Willow. Now, Laurel Willow is not the weeping willow type, but Prairie Reflection is a good rounded tree. The leaves are nice and shiny. I love that one. Oaks. Oaks maybe tend to be a little slower growing than some tree, but still they should have a good rate of growth. And of course, they're going to be there for 400 years or so. Elms, there's good new elm types that are disease resistant. So there are some good choices for replacement of trees.
And are all of these relatively, I don't want to say quick growing, but they will grow at a faster than an oak, faster than...
Exactly.
Okay.
All that I mentioned there, such as the lindens, the hackberries, the buckeye, prairie reflection, willow, they've got a good rate of growth. When I say good, a tree should be growing anywhere from 12 to 24 30 inches or so. And that's a good rate of growth. Poplars notice I didn't put poplar on the list. I mean, if you want a fast growing tree, for 30 to 40 years, poplar's a good choice. They can grow 3 to 6 feet in 1 year easily. But again, they're short-lived.
You planted relatively recently, and again, in a tree's life, relatively recently is maybe the last 10 years. What is it, a river birch? Or
yes. Yes, a multi-trunked river birch. So instead of being the white-barked birch, they're a tannish-colored birch.
How fast do those grow, and how's that one coming along?
It's coming along nicely. Now, in our area, I need to mulch around it to preserve the moisture. I've got a small ring of mulch around it, but I'm going to expand that since birch like it moist and cool. I'm going to expand that circle of mulch, which can speed the rate of growth also because it has less grass competition. And so since that's now 7 or 8 years, and I'm going to expand the circle of mulch, and the river birch is doing quite well.
Okay.
It's beautiful. And of course, they only get more beautiful in time as the trunk size increases. Then they start developing that beautiful exfoliating bark, the papery bark. In this case, it's got the tannish, reddish bark instead of the white of the paper birch types.
All right. Well, we've been talking about trees. Let's take a quick little break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about what to do with your gardens after a storm or before a storm. Are there things that we can do to prepare for a storm?
Get 6 months of local news for just $2. You get unlimited access to the news and information you need to stay connected to your community. Visit inforum.com/subscribe to get 6 months of local news for just $2.
All right, we're back. We're talking about with the recent storms we've had, how to assess your yard, things that you can do if you've had tree damage. We talked about that. But let's talk about the gardens, yard and garden. Are there things we can do to prepare for if we know we're going to get high winds or hail? I mean, with rain, rain comes.
When there's hail forecast as a possibility, I always get nervous with that. And so, hail can just devastate a yard quickly. In your vegetable garden, if a hailstorm comes at the midpoint of summer, it can be late, not impossible to plant some things, but for many things that can be late, to restart tomato plants and things. And so it's interesting. How could we mitigate hail damage a little bit? On tomato plants, for anyone who has them staked or caged, putting a tarp or even a sheet or something over the tomato cage can at least help break the hail a little bit, break the force of the hail. Maybe you can't cover all of your tomato plants, but maybe you can protect a couple so that even if you do get hail, at least you'll have some things. If a person is tarping things, it's important not to have that tarp directly on the plant. That's why I mentioned, cages or supports around the plant and then draping the protection over that. For example, if a person just lays a tarp or weights a tarp down over a tomato plant or a flowering plant, oftentimes that tarp can cause more damage than if you did nothing. If this storm passes and you don't get hail, the tarp itself, weighting it down, the plant down, or getting
if it collects
water, and so that may do more damage than if you had done nothing. And so, did you try to protect yours when in this last storm? Because they were forecasting hail possibilities, high wind, heavy rain. So did you try a few things?
Yeah, we did. We have I think they're called T-bars, those green kind of things they're holding up fencing around our raised garden. And so we stretched tarps over that. And that kind of brings up, we didn't end up having hail here, and it ended up with the winds weren't so bad. So we probably took, I don't want to say unnecessary. We took precaution that maybe we didn't need to. That's fine. But that was one of the things that when I went out to check it that night, I did realize is that in some areas, waters would pool. And you think about this like at the street fair or places where there's a tent where the water will pool in a low area, and that it's going to only collect there. So you have to either stay on top of that. So what I'm thinking next time, what I would do is I would try to do that over individual plants.
Oh, sure.
And then have something kind of tall in the middle of that plant, whatever, or next to that plant, so that water cascades around all sides, and not to try to cover a bigger area
down in the middle of the tent. And possibly break down the plant that you were hoping to protect.
Yeah, not try to cover as much area as possible. We had big tarps, so we had to kind of do that.
And the person might even suggest, because we all love our growing season, maybe we can't protect everything, but maybe some containers that have nice annuals in, maybe you can get those or either group them together and then tent over them like you suggested.
If they're small enough, some things, buckets just if you've got big 5-gallon buckets, if you could put them with your tomatoes, maybe a little too big, maybe a little too big now, but maybe pepper plants are not
exactly
that you can do that. And you just have them on for the storm. You take them right off as soon as the storm
we were
passes.
actually gone for this last storm. We were out of town, but this had been forecast, the possibility. So with some pots of coleus, I had quite a few pots of coleus, larger container pots of coleus. And they can be awfully brittle. It doesn't take too much to beat up a coleus plant. And so I moved those up onto our porch in a spot that was maybe less prone to wind. And so I did move some things around, moved some things up closer to the house foundation. So a lot of the annual pots and things, I tried to get those in spots that maybe would be less affected. Yeah, because it's interesting. If a storm goes through and causes a lot of damage, even if you've got some things yet that look normal, and even in the garden, a few tomato plants can help you kind of, have something. And so otherwise, it is hard to protect a person's yard, isn't it? Like hail can, on hosta, hail can just make ribbons out of hosta. And but again, blankets or something that you put on, then they get rain soaked. They may just squish the hosta worse than if you did nothing. It's tricky, isn't it?
Yeah. What would one thing too, we've got certain areas where we find out if you get a downpour, you may see that an area actually does pool water that normally with a regular rain or watering, you don't see it. In that situation, should we be moving those plants, not during the storm, but should you consider moving those plants? And if so, can we do that in the middle of summer? Is that okay?
Yes, in fact, this is the 50th anniversary in 2025, about this time of year. This is the 50th anniversary of the 1975 summertime flood in the Fargo area. Fargo area received, and Kevin Wallavand, we should get Kevin on, WDAY, a longtime reporter. We should get him on the podcast. He, I believe, recently did a story on this 50-year summertime flood. And the end of June 1975, the area was deluged by approximately 17 inches of rain. I remember that. I just graduated high school, and I remember that. It got the Cheyenne River Valley, the Red River, rivers rose at a speed I had never seen before, and I don't think I've seen since. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is because that was a summertime flood that deluged and flooded many people's gardens, flower beds, farm crops, farm fields. And so a similar type situation, okay? And a summertime flood is different than a spring flood. When everything is dormant in the springtime floods, March or April, everything is dormant. Plants can take being underwater because they aren't growing. They don't need the oxygen. But in the middle of summer, when plants get inundated with water and their root system have standing water, they can die in a matter of days, 3 days, 4 days. And it's going to take a while for that water not only to drain away, but for the soil not to be super saturated. And so your point being, John, if we have summer rain events like that, where plants are standing in water, you might not have any option other than to move those. The soil will probably be really mucky, but if it looks like that plant is going, a perennial, for example, is going to stay in water for more than a couple of days, I would try moving it to higher ground. Lilacs, I learned this the hard way. Lilacs are one shrub that will not tolerate wet feet. So it doesn't even have to be a summer deluge. But if it's at the back of the property where water kind of drains, lilacs die. We planted a whole hedge that died because water flowed towards that area at the back of the lot, stayed a little too wet. The lilacs died. I wished I would have moved those before they died, I didn't. So we bought new ones and put them on higher ground. But your point is well taken, John, that if that happens, we might not have any choice other than to move some perennials out of the soggy situation because, they might not make it otherwise.
When you're planting in your yard or garden or by the house or a vegetable garden, do you take any into consideration things like winds and things like that? Do you try to plant things that maybe you just give them a little bit of shelter, or is it just kind of expecting that Mother Nature will come and Mother Nature will do her thing?
John, that would be a really good idea. And
but you also don't want to limit yourself to
right.
where,
that would be an awesome idea. I'm mentally picturing our landscape to see, okay, when we had to redo it about 8-9 years ago, did I do it right? Okay, now I'm thinking arborvitae.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, not arborvitae, hydrangea, Annabelle hydrangea. Okay, they can be very susceptible to wind whip. They get the big, heavy flower heads, and rain or wind can just decimate those. So I planted those on the north side, the shady side, because that type of hydrangea really loves the shade. Luckily, that's a little bit protected, so I think I did okay on that. I think I probably came out okay with locating things in places where they wouldn't be wind damaged, I think by luck. But that would be a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Things that would maybe, be a little less apt to be blown apart by wind.
How about like when wind is in the forecast? Are there things you can do like with a hydrangea? Can you kind of stake around a hydrangea and rope kind of a perimeter around? Will that help?
And burlap.
Okay.
Yep, stakes. For example, rather than trying to protect a hydrangea by draping something over it, which that in itself would probably tend to break it down, but maybe keeping on hand some taller wooden stakes, 3-foot, 4-foot wooden stakes, or some fence posts. You can buy the shorter fence posts, fairly economical, and then keep them on hand. But having even such as burlap or something in which you put in the wooden stakes and then tie burlap to it so that the burlap would break the wind, rather than having burlap or other covering directly on the plant. So that would be an idea too. And again, some of this depends on if you have enough forewarning.
Right.
And, Mother Nature's tricky. Sometimes we just kind of hope it doesn't happen. But, a little preparation would certainly help.
All right, let's take a quick break. And then when we come back, we're going to talk about, with 4th of July coming up, what Independence Day for gardeners means.
If you're loving this podcast, be sure to check out our full lineup. From news and local politics to sports and true crime, find your next great listen right now at inforum.com/podcasts. That's inforum.com/podcasts.
All right, we're back. We've been talking about, here we are at the end of June, we've had some summer storms, dealing with that, but we're heading into the 4th of July holiday. And you've talked about for a while, Independence Day for gardeners. What do you mean by that?
Yes, and it's good to talk about something positive after talking about storm damage. So yes, let's head for the positive. Independence Day for gardeners. That term was passed along to me by Professor Neil Holland, a longtime well-known area gardener and professor of horticulture. Well, he coined the term, maybe he borrowed it from somebody, Independence Day for gardeners, meaning there are certain things after the 4th of July that we become independent from. We no longer have to do them.
Yes.
And so let's take a look at some of the things that at that point, the 4th of July, we can discontinue doing after the 4th of July. So some of the things: harvest of rhubarb and asparagus. We pluck their stems and leaves the first half of the summer, but from July 4th on, it's our turn to be good to that rhubarb and asparagus plant. Plants need leaves to photosynthesize and store up energy for next year. And so, we've plucked the rhubarb the first half of the season, or, lots of the leaves and stems. So now we need to let the leaves form and re-energize the plant. It'll be fine with rhubarb kind of at the tail end of the growing season. Do take a few stems for pies and things like that. Now with asparagus, about this time of year, they start forming the big poofy. There's that botanical term again. That big poofy, the fern-like growths up above, and ours are already doing that. At a certain point, when you're harvesting asparagus, at a certain point they just start coming up and then start branching out and forming this big fern-like growth on top. Ours have already done that. So even if yours didn't do that, you should stop the harvest about now, 4th of July, and then let that big top form. And that is energizing that plant for the last half of the growing season. And so very important on that. Well, some other things that we discontinue doing. And one of those is after the 4th of July, we really shouldn't fertilize perennials or shrubs or trees or probably even roses. And here's the reason why. We want to fertilize things, not old trees, they're fending for themselves, but younger trees you might want to fertilize a little. But shrubs that you're wanting to coax into better growth, or maybe they're flowering shrubs, or perennials and roses, the first half of the growing season, when they're putting out their big flush of growth, they're hungry.
Yep. They're doing a lot of work.
Yes, they're hungry and they need the fertilizer. And so they'll put out more prolific growth. For example, a clematis vine. When we fertilize it in May and again in June, that fertilizer gives it the nutrition to burst forth with all the blossoms that it has. But from July 4th on, things such as clematis vines, roses, perennials, they need to start getting ready for winter already. So the last half of the growing season, those plants already have enough nutrition. We've already fed them well. And so from July 4th on, they need to just use up those nutrients, and they need to start toughening up a little bit for the winter that is sure to come. For example, if you continued fertilizing some of these things continually all summer long, they would continue to put out lush growth that might not have time to toughen up, harden off as winter would come, and then you get more dieback. So as long as it's got enough nutrition up to the 4th of July, then the last half of the season, it'll start just slowly getting ready for the approaching winter. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that we should stop annual flower fertilizing. Annual flowers, of course, keep blooming all summer long. So geraniums are heavy feeders. And annual flowers, the pots and baskets and wave petunias and all of those, heavy feeders, meaning they will respond very well to the fertilizer we give. So weekly or every other week, continue fertilizing those as you have. Most pruning should stop. Even if you're kind of doing a little bit of trimming on things, the best time, of course, to do the major trimming on trees, shrubs is during the dormant season before growth starts in April or first part of May. But even if you're doing a little bit of trimming or shaping, it's best not to do that after the 4th of July, because what happens is pruning stimulates growth. When you cut it back, you'll get a proliferation of growth, and that proliferation of growth might not have time to toughen in again for winter, and then it might just freeze off. So now on roses, though, we can continue, even after the 4th of July, we can continue deadheading. So when I talk about, don't prune, we're talking about trees, shrubs, but continue deadheading perennials. As the perennials are done blooming. For example, I deadheaded our peonies.
Yep.
Ours are about done. So rather than letting that green seed pod form, which just saps energy, prune that off. And on roses, it's important on the repeat blooming type of roses to deadhead them once that rose is withered. Deadhead down to a 5 or 7 leaflet leaf. Have you ever heard that, John? Right below the rose flower, the next leaf down, and rose leaves are composed of leaflets. A number of leaflets compose the leaf. Okay, well, right below the flower on the stem is usually a 3-leaflet leaf. If you cut back to that, oftentimes you won't get another flower bud.
Oh.
So you go further down and look for the next, either a 5-leaflet leaf, or sometimes it'll be a 7. And so cut down to one of those, and right above one of those, and then that will burst forth in a new bloom, as long as it's a reblooming rose types, which are most popular now. So on those, we can continue on. And so anyway, the July 4th, the Independence Day for gardeners, is kind of that cutoff. We switch our habits a little bit. We can still plant some things, but we don't do the big planting push like we do in May and June. And so Independence Day for gardener then frees us up from some of these other tasks. And weeding. We go into weeding mode, like I mentioned at the start of the program, weeding mode and kind of caring for our things, making sure that the watering during dry times, that the watering is sufficient. And so it's an interesting kind of breaking point. Independence Day for gardeners. Some things we don't do any longer from July 4th onward.
Give you a little bit of time to sit back and enjoy your yard.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And, I'm glad you mentioned that, John. It's so important at the height of summer to take the time and look at how everything is. In fact, I mentioned weeding. One of my favorite ways to weed is simply walk around the yard each evening, look at the landscape. When you see little weeds, stop and pull them. And if you do a little bit of weeding each day, it's not so bad. But also, what that causes a person to do is to look at the things, the perennials, the shrubs, look at how everything is doing, and maybe just sit and look and enjoy. And the annual flowers that are coming into such glory now, it's fun just to see how they are, their forms, their colors. And so in high summer, it is a good time just to kind of revel in it.
Yeah.
We work a good chunk of the year is for this high point of summer and onward.
Enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. So I know once in a while, people that tend to be of a pessimistic order say, well, July 4th, everything's downhill after that. But no, July 4th, in many ways, the high summer, perennials start blooming. Many of the midsummer perennials are blooming, and we can really enjoy. Do you have a bench in your garden?
We've got a couple of chairs. Yeah.
Yeah. And we've got a couple chairs, a bench, and sometimes I'm so busy with weeding that I don't always just sit there, but oftentimes I do. Even if it's for a few minutes, just sit there and really just soak it all in. So this is definitely one of my favorite times of summer.
All right. Well, if people have questions for you about either storm damage or things to do midsummer now, or questions like we were talking about kind of the wrapping up some of your fertilizing, people have any questions for you, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinsler, Kinzler, at ndsu.edu. And thanks for everyone who writes in.
And if they have photos with their questions or things or any ideas for you, they send those along too, right?
Oh, that's perfect. Yep. Email is wonderful for attaching photos along with it. And also share your successes. Continue doing that as well.
Well, Don, thanks a lot.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for listening.